So, here we are going to specifically talk about some properties of the word or and some properties of the word if then, that is conditional. Yeah. Now, in or there are two types of or. One is called the exclusive or, another is called the inclusive or. So, this many times can lead to confusion. Okay. Now, for both I will give one example. Now, let us say I will take a statement P, a student can have French or Sanskrit as third language. Let us talk about this. This is or. Now, in this case what can happen is, when we say a student can have French or Sanskrit as third language, that means he can either take French or Sanskrit, but he cannot take both. It is very clear. So, this or, when both cannot happen, is called as the exclusive or. Such or is called exclusive or. That means, if a student is going to that school or college, he can either take French or Sanskrit. He can never say I want both. So, that means in this or it is understood that either you have to take French or you have to take Sanskrit, but you cannot take both. Yeah. So, when either this or this compulsorily happens, but not both can happen, such or is called as exclusive or. Now, let us take another statement called Q. Let us say to vote, I will take a statement like this: to vote you need a passport or voter ID. Now, see this or. Okay. To vote you need a passport or voter ID. That means you can have a passport, you can have a voter ID, you can have both also. See, that means to vote, if passport is there, you can show the passport. If voter ID is there, you can show voter ID. Also, you can bring both. Yeah, but here it is not this or. In this or, that is not possible. Both are not possible. In this or, both are possible. Such or are called inclusive or. Okay. Now, to understand this better, one more example I will give. Let me call it as statement R. In a restaurant, let us say with thali, Pepsi or ice cream is available. Now, you have to decide what kind of or is this. With thali, Pepsi or ice cream is free. Okay. That means once you have the thali, you cannot ask for both. Yes, that means they have said with thali Pepsi or ice cream is available. Either if you do not want ice cream, you can go for Pepsi. If you do not want Pepsi, you can go for ice cream, but you cannot say I want both. You can't say according to this. So, either Pepsi or ice cream, one of them is available. You can't have both. Therefore, this is something like this. Therefore, this is an example for exclusive or. So, therefore, actually this or has two properties. Sometimes it can be exclusive, sometimes it can be inclusive. Yes. So, when both can happen with or, then it is called inclusive. If both cannot happen, then it is said to be an exclusive or. Okay. Now, that is about the word or. Now, we will have some discussion with the word if then. Okay. Now, if then is called a conditional, and this conditional has very important properties. Okay. Now, one property is there is something called as a converse for a conditional. So, we will talk about the converse, we will talk about the inverse, and we will talk about the contrapositive. So, these are three very important words, and these are regularly coming in competitive exams, especially these three words we are very familiar with this in many competitive exams: converse, inverse and contrapositive. Okay. What is meant by converse? Suppose we have a conditional P then Q, then the converse is always Q then P. So, Q then P is called the converse of P then Q. What is inverse? Inverse is if you negate it directly. So, inverse is, so this is converse, inverse is negation of P then negation of Q. This is called the inverse. And what is contrapositive? Contrapositive is negation of Q then negation of P. If you negate the second one first and write this as negation of Q then negation of P, it is called contrapositive. So, we can take some simple example to understand this. Okay. Let us say if I take statement P as, let us say, a triangle. Okay. If n is an integer, then n is rational. Yeah, let us say this is the statement. Okay. Now, if you want to write the converse, now here n is an integer is P, n is rational is Q. So, the statement is P then Q. So, this is the statement. Now, if you want to write the converse, so converse is nothing but Q then P. That is, if n is rational, then n is an integer. Yeah, this is called converse. Next, what is inverse? Inverse is negation P then negation Q. So, P should be negated, and all these are also conditional. So, they have to start with the word if. So, inverse is negation of Q then negation of P. So, if you negate P, if okay, n is an integer, negation is n is not an integer. If n is not an integer, then n is not rational. So, this is called the inverse. And if you want the contrapositive, suppose you want the contrapositive, it is negation of Q then negation of P, or it is the converse of this. So, negation of Q, if, okay, so sorry, this is inverse is negation of P then negation of Q. Contrapositive is negation of Q then negation of P. So, if n is not rational, then n is not an integer, Okay. So, therefore, these are the three statements: converse, inverse and contrapositive, and their definition goes like this. Okay. Now, another very important property of a conditional is P then Q. In P then Q, okay, this is also called the antecedent, this is also called the consequent. These are some of the words that you have to know. The first one is called the antecedent, the second one is called the consequent. Okay. Other than that, there is a very important thing that we need to remember here, and we need to know this P is called sufficient condition. This is called sufficient condition for Q, and Q is called necessary condition for P. Now let's go little bit deeper into this, so you'll understand what is actually this. Okay, now it's better to take an example and do this. Now let me give a statement like this. If I have 10 rupees, then I have 5 rupees. Now you know this statement is true. If I have 10 rupees, then surely I have 5 rupees. Okay. Now here having 10 rupees, I having 10 rupees is called sufficient condition. Okay. Now what is this? That means having 10 rupees is sufficient condition for having 5 rupees. That means I can say that having 10 rupees, having 10 rupees is sufficient to have 5 rupees. So you know this. See, you know if you have 10 rupees, having 10 rupees is sufficient to have 5 rupees. Okay. So when you have 10 rupees, you have 5 rupees. See, having 10 rupees is sufficient. So if you have 10 rupees, suppose somebody asks you for 5 rupees, okay, you can give it. So having 10 rupees, this condition is also called sufficient condition for this. Okay. Now other way, this second condition is necessary condition. That is, having 5 rupees is necessary for having 10 rupees. That is, having 5 rupees, so having 5 rupees is necessary. See, this is always necessary for this to happen. Having 5 rupees is necessary for having 10 rupees. Now you can see this is also correct. Okay. If you want to have 10 rupees, you necessarily should have 5 rupees. Without having 5 rupees, how will you have 10 rupees? That means having 5 rupees is necessary for having 10 rupees. Only if you have 5 rupees, you can have 10 rupees. Okay. So that means this second condition is necessary for this to happen. I have taken a simple example so that you really understand what is sufficient and what is necessary condition. So therefore, students always remember P is called sufficient condition for Q and Q is called necessary condition for P. They will give you a random statement in the exam and they will ask you to identify which is sufficient condition and which is necessary condition. Sufficient condition should come first, necessary condition should come second. And students, this statement is there, no? I have 10 rupees, then I have 5 rupees. This is called a conditional because it imposes a condition. If this should happen, then this should happen. This can also be written using the word only if. So this is the third property. This statement, if then, can also be written using the word only if. So what you can say is, I have 10 rupees. Now here you should not start with the word if, okay. The if word will come in the middle. So I have 10 rupees. I have 10 rupees only if I have 5 rupees. And you can see this statement also becomes correct. I have 10 rupees only if I have 5 rupees. If I don't have 5 rupees at all, then how can I have 10 rupees? So therefore, I have 10 rupees only if I have 5 rupees. So this statement also is correct. So therefore, in this we learnt how to write the sufficient condition, how to identify it, how a statement means the same using the word sufficient, using the word necessary. Okay. So these are the very important things, and these are very common questions pertaining to all these things that are going to come.